Welcome to What's Your Next Move, the podcast for peak performers who are making things happen but are running into roadblocks that prevent them from getting what they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battisil, and I want to know, what's your next move? Hi there, I'm Arlene Battisil, your host and resident provocateur, and I am thrilled to have my guest today, Sherry Strong, who is accompanied by her aging Burmese cat, who I'm sure will be chiming in on our conversation today as he or she sees fit. So we'll see what your cat has to say as we get into our conversation. So let your cat know that. What's your cat's name?
His real name is Billy Cart, but we call him Billy for short.
All right. Well, you let Billy know. Billy is welcome to say whatever he has to say today. So anyways, just by way of background, Sherry is, I'm just going to give it to you straight. She's a food philosopher, an entrepreneur, a celebrity chef, an author, an award-winning speaker, and a nutritionist. And she's been on just about every media outlet known to man, woman, and Billy. And what we're going to be talking about today is the thing that has brought Sherry all of this renown. And it has to do with her historical relationship with sugar. And that is something that most, if not all of us, struggle with. And we struggle with it in ways that we probably aren't even aware, but with the predominance of sugar throughout all of our lives. I really wanted to talk with Sherry about this because I think that she has a perspective on this that can be really, really helpful to people, especially in terms of how people can break their addiction to sugar and do it in a way that does not have to be so grueling. And so, Sherry, thank you very, very much for being with me today. You have such an esteemed background, and I feel so honored to have you. And let's just get underway with this conversation about our big addiction, and that is with the white stuff called sugar. Welcome.
Yes. Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for that beautiful introduction.
It was well-deserved, trust me. Now, you know what? Why don't you talk to me just a little bit before we really get into the nitty-gritty of this thing? Why don't you talk to me about what you're doing right now and what's happening in your life right now?
So I run an 8-week online program that helps people get off of sugar. I run it 4 times a year, and we're going through our second one of this year right now. And so that's always pervasive in my life. You know, I'm really dedicated to helping people with that piece, because I know that if they can knock that piece off in their life, it's, you know, there's so many other things that they can knock off, and it opens them up to unlimited potential. Mm-hmm. And the other project I'm working on, I'm writing a new book. So I wrote a book called Return to Food, The Life-Changing Anti-Diet. And I'm working on 2 consecutively, a memoir based on my sugar addiction, and another one called Inspired Eating, How God Wants Us to Eat. And that came about from over 10 years ago. I was interviewing Neil Donald Walsh, and he was looking at the illustrations I was doing for my book. And he said, you know what you should call this book? What God thinks we should eat. And I wasn't ready to handle anything with God in the title. It was kind of like, what? Me? Who? Me? No. Mm-hmm. Frightened. But, you know, I'm a big believer in following my intuition. And right now there's just been that many things with intuition that I'm ready to step into the book. And I changed what to how and should to want. And that feels better for me. So, and it's been a very interesting journey just since taking that task up. Yeah.
Right. Well, you know what? Let's get right into this with the whole business of sugar addiction. And if you can walk me back in time, perhaps to a few different things. People don't become addicted to things for no reason. And the addiction is just a manifestation of something. And if you feel comfortable about it, could you kind of walk me through the things that were happening in your life at the time that you really headed in the direction of the sugar addiction?
Well, I was an addict from birth. So my mother was convinced by doctors and nurses that this baby formula was better for her child than breast milk. And at the time, it's not too different today, but they use refined sugars, oil, salts, refined grains, and chemicals in baby formula, and many still do. And so what it does is right from birth, you're set up for sugar addiction. Now, physiologically, we're predisposed to be, attracted to sugar, and nature gives us stronger physiological desires because it's harder to obtain in nature and it's less abundant. So we really work for it when we find it. And that works in nature, but it doesn't work so much in the supermarket where nature's tipped up, upside down.
Right.
And so I basically, I can't remember a day in the first 3 decades of my life where I didn't have refined sugar, and in some form or another, and unwittingly, even when I thought I was eating healthy or good. And I think probably the worst part of it was at one point I was a chef. So in my mid-20s, I was a chef working in some of the best restaurants. So I thought I had, professional license to eat anything I wanted.
Wow.
And I did. I was twice my present size. So I wasn't 10'4". I haven't had a massive height reduction. I can actually fit into one pant leg of the pants I wore when I, was at my largest.
Wow.
And so I have that story, and obviously the shame of being overweight and how we were treated, fat shaming and all that kind of thing was painful. But the worst part of sugar addiction for me was depression. And it was really, I didn't have the courage to kill myself, but I didn't want to live when, it just sucked the joy out of my life. And I wasn't really living. And I remember one day lying in bed and I rolled over and my stomach followed. It was like 2 different things. It was like, wasn't, attached. It was like this extra body that I was carrying it. And it was just one of those realization points where you're just going, okay, yeah, this is not good. I'm waking up depressed with a sugar coma, each day, not feeling great about life. And even just the consumption of, the time that I was obsessed with social, everything, revolved around food and sugar. And I knew that there had to be kind of a change because I was sick. I was pre-diabetic. I had migraines. I had back pain. It was just all those things that a lot of people, even just one of them, kind of take for granted as that's just part of being human, but it's actually not. It's actually part of our disconnection from nature. And really, I think when I work with a lot of people, what it really comes down to, in some form or another, it's our disconnection between nature and our nature. So we either disconnecting from the source of nourishment, energy, and protection against disease, which is, real food and clean water, or the separation from doing things based on what actually feels right in our soul, in our gut.
Right. Now, Sherry, can I ask you about this having happened to you from birth? In my experience of people who are addicted to sugar, and most of them are adults and they've struggled with their sugar addiction most of their life, but they didn't start with sugar. And many of them have come out of households where they were not permitted to drink soda. They were not permitted any sugar. And then later on in life, they, started with the sugar. And they were doing it out of an emotional need that they were feeding. But for you, was the addiction something that was actually physiological, and then there was an emotional piece that followed?
Well, it depends on who you speak to, which expert, but I would say they were both going on. And I grew up in a very dysfunctional home, lots of violence and poverty and alcohol abuse, and just, from 2 parents who were children. My mom was 15 and my dad was 19 when they first started having kids, and I was third born and my mom was 20. And, and they had a tumultuous relationship. And so you feel that as a baby in vitro, and you utero, I should say. You feel it and you grow up with it. And so I never felt safe. I never felt, that stability, and sugar was always there. It was like a comfort that was always there. And so I would say that they were going on in tandem, and one feeds the other.
Right. And what's so tricky about this thing is that with them going in tandem, given what you just described about the world that you came into, it was convenient that there was an elixir there, unfortunately, one that was very harmful to you. But if you couldn't soothe yourself in the environment that you were in, you had something that you were able to use to soothe yourself. And did you feel at that time, even very early on, that the sugar was a way that you were soothing yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I know that for sure. And very well put, Arlene, I have to say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so in your earliest memory, when did you become conscious, given that this happened so early on in your life, from birth, in fact, when did you become conscious that maybe this wasn't such a good idea?
It's fascinating. I have vivid memories of being, at 2 years old, choking on a lifesaver. I always find that irony very funny.
Yeah,
lifesaver almost killed me. And then freebasing Tang in the backyard, like getting the packet of Tang and licking my finger and dipping my finger into it. And I actually, just the memory of it is bringing up my salivary glands are kind of watering. Wow. I because I was never without it as a child, I never realized it was a problem. I just thought that's how I was. I thought I was a moody child of all the children. My mom had 4. I was the only one who cried, constantly and had health ailments. All the other children were, relatively calm given what was going on. And when I was 14, I got to a level of depression where I thought of suicide. Again, never had the courage to do it. And so my parents took me to a therapist, and the therapist tested me for having hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia is just basically the body's natural reaction from having too much sugar. And so we tried a diet and with some artificial sweeteners, and I knew there was something there then, because it was the first time I was trying to go without it. And I realized, okay, yeah, this felt bigger than me. I felt that sugar was stronger than me.
Right. Wow. And, I'm curious about what you just said about your parents taking you to a therapist, and thinking about how old you were at 14, and that puts your mother at barely 30. And I'm curious about, given the dynamics in the household and all of what was going on for all those years of you growing up into your early teens, how did they have the foresight to decide you needed to go to a therapist? I mean, it seems like there's a big disconnect there, because if all these things were going on in the home that were obviously very harmful and destructive to children, how then, as you're turning 14, do they somehow see the light that there's a need for help?
Well, I confessed to my parents that, I didn't want to live. And although my parents, I wouldn't describe them then as very conscious people. I know that with every resource within them, they loved us. They just didn't have life skills.
Right.
So I think it was a matter of going to the doctor. Is there something wrong? And then the doctor then referring to a therapist.
Got it. Wow. That's incredible. Well, I'm sure, when a child is making reference to not wanting to live, I think that's enough of an alarm bell for anyone. They don't have to even be very conscious of anything. But if a kid says, I don't want to live, I think we've got a problem. Maybe we need to do something about this. We don't know what, but something needs to happen here. Now, as you were going through your, early childhood on into your early teens, obviously the more sugar you're eating, I'm assuming you're gaining weight, and that is now introducing a whole different problem. And at what point did you start suffering from the social criticism that comes with weight gain?
Well, so I was probably anywhere from a size 7 to a 9. I'm 5'2". I'm very muscular in my build. So apart from just vanity and not looking like a supermodel, it really wasn't a problem until my mid-20s. That's when my eating actually got out of control. When I became a chef, I actually moved to Australia. Well, I went traveling, ended up moving to Australia, became a chef, got married to someone who was very selfish. So loved me as best as he possibly could, but it was about his life, his family, his career, his country, all that kind of stuff. And I felt very alone.
Right.
And so between that, becoming a chef, and that kind of feeling very alone, sugar quickly became my fast friend. And then I started to gain weight rapidly. So that was...
And it seems that in the culinary industry, if someone's going to be gaining weight, it is, I don't know so much that it's condoned, but because we see so many chefs that weigh considerably more than the people around them, it's just a sign of someone being a great chef and they love the food that they cook, and you are not really paying attention to their weight as much as you're paying attention to the greatness of them as a chef. And so did you find that as a chef, there was nothing in place to kind of call you out on your behavior because of the industry that you were working in?
Oh, absolutely. In the industry, there's nothing to call you out. And even, outside of the industry, there's a famous saying that says, never trust a skinny chef. But the truth is that I actually had to work hard to become obese. Like I had to eat a boatload of food in order to do that. And that is never about taste. That's never about the profession and the skill, because the people who are at the top of their game in this industry, who have a balanced life, who don't have, serious emotional issues going around, don't have that obesity factor going on. There are several that do, but it's usually as a result to the emotional world where they're actually seeking comfort with food, because you have to eat a lot to actually get, become
right.
So there's that going on. But here's the other piece. If you're feeding people delicious food and you're giving them pleasure that way, they're willing to overlook a lot of things.
Well, and they're also predisposed to be giving you kudos for what it is that you're doing for them, because when you give pleasure to people, they think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
What a dangerous profession to be in. But how, at that time, obviously, here you are in Australia, you're with your partner who your needs are, if I may be so blunt, not being met, and probably very similar in many ways to the relationship with your family growing up, where the absence of, what you needed when you were young now just, goes a couple of decades into your adult life, and now you're in a relationship with someone where once again your needs are not being met, and you're looking in the direction of the thing that you're soothing yourself with. And can you talk a bit about that time when you were in Australia and you were in this relationship and you were cooking? You said that you felt really alone, but can you talk a bit more about that time? Because now you're in the world of food. Was there anything going on for you, anything like a little voice or anything that was saying to you, Sherry, trying to get your attention about this?
Yes. It's a funny thing, because I knew my days as a chef were numbered, because I never really loved the pump and pressure of service.
Right.
I loved cooking and creating throughout the day, but cooking the same thing every day and then having to perform, under the severe pressure never sat well with me. So I started a cooking school called the Food Lovers Workshop, and I just started teaching classes that I thought people would want to attend. And one of them was low-fat, quick and easy meals.
Mm-hmm.
And I was teaching this course, and I thought, this is really funny. Even at the time, I was like, I'm twice what I'm meant to be, what I am now. And I'm teaching a low-fat cooking class, and I'm wondering if my students are thinking, does she eat any of this stuff, or is she eating all of this stuff? And so there's those little twinges there. And then a doctor and a dietitian started sending their clients to me because the approach that I was using was a non-diet approach. And it was basically saying there are foods and dishes that are naturally low in fat that are absolutely delicious. And if you want a creme brulee with half the fat, have half a serve. And so the thing that probably I didn't realize at that point was sugar was a bigger contributor to obesity than fat was. So it was a slow process of learning, but I then became involved with Nutrition Australia. The doctor I was working with invited me to come and be on the board of Nutrition Australia, and a year later they asked me to become the Victorian chair of Nutrition Australia. And so I started to feel a sense of responsibility beyond myself to live and eat well. And I then started studying at university, studying nutrition, and I started to realize how corrupt the university system was when it came to teaching people the truth about nourishment and food. And so I went on my own journey to help me understand first what it is we're meant to be eating, so that I could then be able to explain and help other people. And that's where I deviated from the traditional nutrition model, the pyramids, the plates, all that kind of thing, and started to look at nature and traditional cultures and what they were eating. And so I was moving from a place, I was starting to wake up essentially. And it's funny because I remember rolling over in bed again one time and looking at my husband and saying, do you ever think you're meant to do something really great in the world? And of course, I was offended at the time at his reaction, because he looked at me as if I was an alien, and I don't even remember response verbally, but I remember his look at me like, what are you talking about? And I was offended because he couldn't see that potential in me. But at the same time, I wasn't actually living my potential. I was this person who was, in serious food and sugar addiction, and wanting, to do great things, but I wasn't actually living my potential. And I knew that I had to handle this.
Right. And I'm curious about the moment at which you decided you needed to do something about this. And it seems directly tied to a moment in time where you were actually being given really positive feedback. This was about, becoming the chair where you're being professionally recognized for what you're doing, that the contribution you're making is really important, and that you are being recognized by professionals in the field. Do you feel, because the thing that I see here that I notice is that up until the moment that you actually started getting this positive reinforcement, there didn't seem to be the impetus for you to do something about this. But in the moment that your needs were apparently being met, it was the stimulant that then led you down the path where you ultimately decided what your next move was, and it was going to be in a direction that was ultimately going to change your life. Do you think that's fair to say?
I do. I think that's part of it. And I think probably a deeper piece is that my soul was calling me to do something. I believe our soul is calling every one of us to do something in the world. And I didn't know what that looked like, but I knew that I was meant to be doing something. And great was probably not the best term when I phrased it, but I think the term I would use now, if I rolled over with the same kind of awareness, is to say, don't you think that we're all meant to do something really meaningful in life? And when I woke up, saying that, I felt it from a soul place. I may not have had the right words, but I felt a calling to do something to make the world a better place. I believe from birth.
Right.
It just took me a long time to get the skills to do it.
Right. And when you had that realization that there was this calling, if you will, did you feel like there was a precipitating event that basically called out that calling in you from your soul? Or was it something that you think was evolving over time that finally presented itself in a moment?
I think a bit of both. And what I do remember, like what this question from you brings up in me is, I remember putting up my hand to give a paper at the Symposium of Gastronomy in Australia. And leading up to it, I was terrified because I'd never done anything. I never presented anything. I've done cooking classes and everything like that, but I never presented anything academically or really intellectually challenging. And I was surrounded by not only some of the greatest chefs in Australia and food, thinkers, gastronomy, intellectuals. So, and I was still relatively young. I was 30 when I gave that paper, and I was terrified to embarrass myself, but I just felt I needed to do it, and I prepared 6 months on that paper to give that paper. And just before I got up, one of my, legendary heroes in the food industry, Stephanie Alexander, who's written, some amazing books, and I worked for her in restaurants, just amazing chef and thinker. She was a librarian before she became a chef. And she's like the Alice Waters of Australia. Mm. She got up and she spoke and she waxed lyrically about her childhood. And I was like, oh my goodness, we had Campbell's soup and and I, practicing my talk for 6 months, something I wasn't a, professional speaker at that point in my life. And just intuitively, I eliminated the first part of my speech and I just went into, pure intuition. I spoke from intuition, and I started out saying, in contrast to Stephanie, I grew up in the culinary equivalent to a gastronomic black hole with seriously bad food. And I went on to describe it, and of course there were people who laughed in the audience and people who identified with it. Mm-hmm. And then I went into my talk, and it was basically, it had a very complicated, simple, satisfying flavors equals complete feeding fulfillment. Yeah. It's a really makey kind of title. But at the end of it, people stood up, people cried. There was, applause and laughter. And I had people come up afterwards. And that talk I refer to as emotional bungee jumping. I was terrified, I practiced, laced up my shoes, got everything. But that leap of giving that talk in front of the people that I'd respected most in the industry was one of the most terrifying things in my life, even to this day, having given a TED Talk in Tokyo, right? Right. But it brought me a level of fulfillment and deep joy and a knowing that this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm.
And what did that moment represent to you where it sounds like it was a moment where every fear that you had ever had in your life was manifesting itself in this one place. What did that represent to you? Why was it so frightening to you?
Well, I think I grew up with a lot of shame. So shame was a feeling that I was very familiar with, but obviously hated. And I think probably one of the things I was seeking most of my life was reasons to feel proud of myself. Mm-hmm. And there's much more to my childhood that I won't go into now, but I felt a deep sense. And I think probably getting up, my biggest fear in front of them was that I would embarrass myself and do something shameful and, and just cement all those feelings that sat so deeply in my bones. And when I actually gave the talk and took that leap of faith, like it was a form of social death, right? That I was facing. I could either die, fall to my death, or I could fly. And what it felt like is I took that leap of faith and I flew.
And to what do you attribute that you actually were able to take that leap of faith? I mean, when you consider, well, let me ask it this way. What is it about you that when you think back about your whole life, your origins, what you experienced, what you've struggled with throughout your whole life, and still come to a place where you can take that leap of faith and fly. I mean, how do you account for the fact that that was the choice you made, especially coming from a moment in time in the past where you didn't know whether or not you wanted to live?
Well, I do believe that we come into this world with our own personalities. And I, even further believe that we come into the world with something that we'd like to do. And I think when we separate from that, we don't feel good. And when we're in line with that, we do feel good. So it's a combination of having, I think, probably a sassy personality to begin with. I read Susan Jeffers' book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I took that to heart. So I did a lot of courageous things that were definitely out of the box for my family. I became religious. I studied to become a missionary. That was my form of rebellion as a child. And my parents were absolutely, horrified at the time. Like, oh my goodness, what's she doing? I traveled. I was the first one in my family to travel overseas. I went to Europe. And I also had some, other experiences within the family. I was sexually abused by an uncle as a child and a family friend at 5 and 6. And then when I went overseas to Europe, I was actually raped in Italy. And so when I came back, I had been studying to become a missionary, but I didn't feel a great deal of sense of support and solace in religion and the people who were around me. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I felt judgment and that felt awful. And so I then, went off to Australia. I was the first person to go to university in my family. So I lived by that principle of like, yeah, I'm afraid, but I'm just going to do it anyway.
Right. And what strikes me, going back to, rolling over and asking the question about being meant to do great things, when you consider where you've come from, what you've gone through, especially at such an early age, and the trauma that you've experienced, and then you go on to a life where you've taken that experience and turned it into something that is helping so many people, that you're on the international stage with a TED Talk in Tokyo, you're in Vogue, you're on the Today Show, what that says to me about you as a person and what was meant for you, it's almost like all of those things had to happen for you to put them together in a way where you could have the maximum impact. And it required a level of strength that most people don't have, and is evidenced in you in spades, because how somebody goes through all of that, especially the emotional deprivation that existed very early on and comes to a place where you are today, is really extraordinary and exceptional.
Wow, I'm crying. Like I'm literally have tears coming down my eyes. That's really beautiful that you can see it and see it that way. So that's
it's a truth, because there's no other way this story goes, because when you turn something where it's almost like you were put on this earth to actually have the experience of things that you could then translate for people into something where they could feel hope, and they could feel that there are other ways of doing things, that they can overcome these things, that they can be experiencing things that are really traumatic and devastating, and still come to a place in their life where they're living a rich and authentic and genuine life that has a level of emotional capacity and an emotional investment in that life with the people that are in your life. It's such an extraordinary story. And when this is all around food and sugar, which is so loaded for all of us, for you to be able to articulate all of this in the way that you have, to me, is just really extraordinary, because I don't know how people go through things like this and come out to where you are. And given your prominence in life now on the international stage, you work with celebrities and CEOs and elite athletes and people who are now seeking you out. I would imagine that when you were very, very young, it would never have crossed your mind that you would go on to live the kind of life that you have. Fair to say?
That's correct. Yes. Very, very, yeah.
What do you think was the most pivotal moment for you that really made you believe that your sense of doing great things in life was actually going to be realized, where you knew it? Was it the moment with the speech?
That was probably the seed of the desire. The seed of the desire was happening then. I think the knowing piece was like building a tower. It was one block at a time. Mm-hmm. So it was like that thing where I didn't have an absolute knowing, but I had a feeling and intuition. This was the next step. And I do know that I wanted it. Like I wanted to be someone who is up on world stages speaking. Like it is my first professional love, as much as I love food and cooking, nothing. It was like, when people get married and they're in love with someone and that marriage ends and then they actually meet the love of their life. That's for me. Yeah.
And how amazing is that, where you actually, your life has a certain trajectory and you're just going along and you think it's one thing and then it completely shifts and morphs into something else. And then you discover, oh, that's what it was supposed to be.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you think you're on you take a detour and you think, what am I doing this for? This doesn't make sense. And there's a lot in my life that intellectually has not made sense. But when you follow the voice of intuition, it reveals itself to be, that's the right choice. So I moved back to Canada after 22 years in Australia, having built, a reputation-based business, where, getting keynote speeches was based on reputation.
Right.
And then I moved back to Canada, my home country, where I was completely unknown.
Right.
And a lot of people thought, well, that's kind of crazy. And intellectually, I couldn't disagree with them. But my intuition said, no, you're meant to come back to Canada. You're meant to be in North America for this next phase.
Wow. That's extraordinary. I know we're very short on time now because we have a hard stop on time for you today. I want to ask you something. What is your relationship to your history today?
Oh, you ask such great questions, Irene. Can I just say that up front? Like you're so incredibly present and insightful and wise, and you ask great questions. Well, I think the piece is, I remember being very young, probably after the assault in Italy happened. And I was very conscious at that time that I could either use this experience to spiral down into misery and lead a terrible life, an unhappy life, or I could use it as an opportunity to work and understand. And it's one of the reasons I've never felt a bit of sadness about getting older. Every year my birthday comes around, I'm like, yes, bring it on. I'm so grateful. For the learning, because every year life just made a little bit more sense. It got a little bit clearer and it was a little less stressful and sad and unhappy and all that kind of stuff. And so I think you ask a great question because it's part of all of us, is that we can use every little bit of our history and we can spin it into gold. We really can. We can actually take all those lessons that we learned. I was also aware that there are people who had much worse lives than I had, who did much more meaningful things. And there were people who had, beautiful, easy life and pursued a life without meaning, just, pursuing stuff and emptiness. And so, it really doesn't matter what your life experience is, whether it's been good or bad. You get a moment in this choice. And it's why I don't believe that 100% in fate. I do believe we have choice, and that we've got this one amazing, beautiful ride that we know of for sure.
Right.
And we get to choose to waste it or make something of it. So I think about tobogganing, when you walk all the way up the hill, in your snow gear and your boots, and some trips are great and some are like, oh man, that was total waste of all that. And I think that's, our history is that walk up the hill, it's the walk up the hill, and how well we use our history can actually determine how great the ride down is. And it's like, yeah, that was worth coming to Earth for. Yeah.
Oh, what a beautiful way of describing that. I love that so very much. That was really beautiful. And I guess I have to follow up that question about your relationship with your history with probably my last question, given our time. What is your relationship today with food and sugar?
Yes, see, and that's a great question. Given everything that you led up to, it is a work in progress. I make no profession to the people that I work with that my relationship with food is perfect. I had an experience yesterday where I was about to give a Zoom session with my crew that are going through the program right now. And I've been getting spring water for many years. I go and gather it myself. I go to the mountains to get it.
Wow.
And I love that experience. I have a great deal of pride in it. I love the water that I get. And for the second time since moving back to Vancouver, corporate interests or government and corporate, have conspired to shut down that spring. And I couldn't find another spring. And I was heartbroken. I literally sobbed for 2 hours on the way home. And in the past, that would have triggered me straight to go into a bakery. And I knew I wasn't, it's in the past, I wouldn't have cared if I had a Zoom session. I would have gone to the bakery, not talked about it, talked about some other head stuff, right? Avoided it. But instead I came home and I had some asparagus. Now, it was not ordinary asparagus. It was like fresh picked. It's like a totally different vegetable.
Yeah.
I had a very, very emotional, very probably inappropriate in public, savoring and enjoying this.
I can see it happening.
I'm a chef first. I'm a hedonist. I love food. And it doesn't mean that I don't have cake on my birthday. I had cake this year. It doesn't mean that I don't have a cinnamon croissant on the weekend when I go to the farmer's market. But I'm no longer using it as a way of stuffing down my emotions. Right. And I'm actually dealing with the discomfort. I'm working through the stuff. And I have, I believe, a holistic relationship with food. It's realistic. I often say that I don't know about past lives or future lives, but if there is such a thing, I know I came to this incarnation for the food. And I'd much rather live to 100 with chocolate than 120 without it. So I'm finding my balance around it. And I have I think probably a more honest relationship with food. And I also I'm moving into the space of being unapologetic for not looking, like something off the cover of Fitness magazine, in the sense that I love food. I don't work out 3 hours a day. I walk, I hike, I move my body. Could definitely do it more consistently than I do. But that is my passion. And, it's one of those things. No one would apologize if a man spent, 8 hours a day in his car practicing race car driving, if that was what he was doing for a living, even though there was a certain amount of risk in what he was doing. Right. I have a professional relationship with food. I have a deeply personal relationship with food. It is a joy, something that I experience great joy from. I don't have a perfect relationship with it. I don't have a perfect relationship with anything, but it's a work in progress. And I think when people start to understand that the physical is just a manifestation of what's going on mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and that we can have a perfect relationship with food, but if you have an imperfect or highly dysfunctional relationship with your spirit, your emotions, or your mind, even if you eat well, it's going to manifest in some kind of imbalance. So for me, it's a process of trying to find in all areas of my life that process of removing toxicity and bringing in nourishment mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and it just naturally tends to manifest in the physical.
Oh my goodness, that is so beautiful, Sherry. And, for you being so honest about where you're at in your life right now. And to that, I say, make no apologies for surviving the life that you've lived and ultimately thrived, because that is clearly what you've done. And it is a work in progress, and you continue to do great things and help so many people and bring them into the awareness of how they are struggling with their emotions and trying to just find ways to soothe. And so I just think, What you've done is really extraordinary and exceptional. And I thank you so very much for sharing all of this with me today and our listeners. I have about 10,000 other questions, and we've got exactly 2 minutes to go. And so I will perhaps save those for another conversation, which I hope we have. But for anyone who'd like to know more about you or find you and possibly see what you have to offer that might help them in their relationship with food and sugar, where can they find you?
Thanks for asking. I have a website called sweetfreedom.ca. And for your listeners, I have a special gift in that I have a 7-day Eat Less Sugar Challenge. And we would sell that for $37. We sold it for $37 online. But for anyone who goes to the website, you'll see that it's free there. We want to have 1 million people taking that Eat Less Sugar Challenge. And if you want to further the relationship with us after that, we're here for you. But there are tons of recipes and resources and videos that you'll see on that website that will help you not just develop, not just curb your sugar addiction and help you end sugar addiction, but really help you develop a healthier relationship with food, your body, and the planet.
Beautiful. Sherry, what is the website again?
Sweet Freedom, so sweet as in sweets, SWEET, freedom.ca. So it's a Canadian site, so
Beautiful.
We couldn't get the .com.
That's okay. As long as we can, people know where to find you, we're golden. So, well, Sherry, thank you again so very much. I know you have to run. So I look forward to talking with you again in the future to see how your journey is progressing and to see more great things from you, because there's no question about it. They've been great thus far. I'm looking forward to the future.
Oh, I would love that, Arlene.
Beautiful. And as we come to the close of another episode, I always ask you to think about where you're at in your life and ask yourself the question, what's your next move? I'm Arlene Battisil. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back with another episode. Welcome to What's Your Next Move, the podcast for peak performers who are making things happen but are running into roadblocks that prevent them from getting what they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battisil, and I want to know, what's your next move?